So today's video is going to be a little bit different because today marks my conclusion of my challenge. And so I figured what would actually kind of make sense for me to finish off having celebrated 30 videos of me just kind of doing whatever, right? Would be for me to actually chronicle and archive the method that I had been using. And so this one is going to be a little bit neat, because I'm going to kind of walk through the process that I had and the thought process that led to what I've been doing. So you might notice that in the bottom corner here, it is top of the hour, just about. I would always try to start making these videos at the top of some hour, and I would give myself exactly 1 hour to finish. Whatever it is that I had at the end of that hour is going on YouTube, period. So the first thing I would need to do is I would open up Audacity, right? For anyone that doesn't know, Audacity is a free program that you can do recordings, you can technically do audio mixing and a lot of other nice things. It is fairly simple. It's not anything crazy like FL Studio. It's not anything that, people are probably using to make award-winning albums, but it is a very simple one for recording audio. So all I would do is I would hit the record button. Once I had that, then I would be just kind of yapping to it, right? And so I think this would cause you can see how I'm talking along, and I have my WAV files. Once that recording is finished, I can go ahead and do a little noise reduction. I get the noise profile, and then I repeat it as an effect. Once that finishes loading, let's just do it. Then I have the OpenVino Whisper transcription. This is super helpful. This is what got my subtitles on the video. So I would click this button here, and then I would go to transcribe, and I wanted this to essentially take my words and turn it into text that I could then import into my video editor. And so for this, I wanted it to be a certain length. I didn't want it to be super long on the screen. And so my number usually was somewhere between 25 and 30. It kept changing around because I was trying to understand exactly what these numbers mean. But 30 is what I ultimately would normally settle on. At first I was using the base model, which the model in this case determines how accurate it is and how long it takes to make. I discovered after a couple of videos that it was not very consistent. I had to make a lot of edits in the subtitles, and that was taking a lot of time. Eventually it became to the point that I was spending about 20 minutes of my hour just fixing subtitles. So I realized I should probably just let it use a stronger model to make that transcription even better. So I just hit apply, and then this is going to go super fast because there's not much words here, but boom. And so you can see there's my recording. I don't even think I said WAV file. But let's see if we were to play this. This would cause you can see how I'm talking along, and I have my WAV files. Oh, I did say WAV file. Okay, that was actually a great transcription. So, and sometimes it gets out of tune, so I'd have to adjust those within the video. But from this point, all I do is I'd export my file, and I'd have my voiceover, and then I would export these labels, as they're called, right? I would have this as a SRT file, and then once I have those two things, Audacity is technically done. I would save this little project. I save all of my files when it comes to making things, just for posterity's sake. So I'd have that all in a folder for that video, and then I would move on to DaVinci. So usually what would happen is that I would have the whisper transcription doing it, because it would normally take maybe 2 or 3 minutes for that to happen. So then during that time, I would have DaVinci loading up, and I would also open Spotify. Big fan of Spotify, and in this case, I was using the Chill Hop playlist. So I would just kind of hit something, make sure it's on shuffle, go random, and then let it play, right? I kind of thumb through as I was waiting for stuff to load up until I found something that kind of like felt like the right vibe. And whoa, oh, this is the lightsaber one. Oh, that's awesome. That's sick. All right. But we have, you know, okay, maybe this is the vibe. So then at that point, I would have to get the audio, and of course, make sure you always credit the audio in your description at the very least. Luckily, all these lo-fi tracks are normally free to use on YouTube. So as long as you credit the artist, everything is pretty much cool there. Also, I'm not making any ad revenue here. Once I got that, I would record that audio just by me kind of like sitting here with OBS, right? Of course, I'm using OBS right now to record this video, so I can't do that. But I would have OBS running and be recording that audio while I then opened DaVinci. And so DaVinci, this is where I made all my videos. I would take the last video that I made, in this case it was the reflection video, and I just straight up make a save, and I call it whatever the new project is called. In this case, I'm going to call it the end of challenge. And I'm just going to delete all this. Bam. Now, the reason why I even bother, since it seems like, oh, well, I'm just coming from a blank slate, I do have some settings and stuff already lined up that I have been continued to iterate on. I have a track here for my voiceover, for my music, and then for other things. Sometimes I have the audio from whatever my visuals are in the background, just to kind of add that little bit, and that would go into the third slot, right? So these are kind of ordered in importance, right? My voiceover is usually the most important, and then I have the music in the background, and then that gameplay footage or something else is in the background. From there, I have a bunch of footage from different games that I can use. Of course, if you've been watching, you've probably noticed that most of them are off of Dark Souls, because I have a good amount of footage, and I also think Dark Souls is super cool. But you can see I have a good number of footage here that I can kind of dive into, and I could use whatever I want. So let's say, for example, I'm going to use Enter the Gungeon. So I'm just going to drag one of these in here, bam, and at this point, my music is probably still playing, right? So I have to be a little bit quiet. I don't want to like cause any issues with my computer getting like overlap sounds in that recording. So I mute the audio, and then I normally will go into the color portion here, and I will just crank the temperature of my video up a bit because I want to give off that warm feeling. This is something I discovered about halfway through on the video called Warm. I realized that, yeah, I should maybe add like a little bit of warmth to the video just to give it that more cozy feel, because we can kind of see in the preview here, this is the normal, and as we crank it up a little bit, it's not super noticeable until you get to a certain point, but it does add a little bit more of that cozy feeling. On top of that, if it causes the colors to be a little bit too bright, I might take the gain down a little bit by clicking on the slider bar, just to kind of make it feel a little bit muted. I don't want to play with saturation. Usually I don't play with saturation too much, but sometimes if it's just too bright, I might play with saturation as well. And then I do a noise, so I go fast noise in my search bar here for effects. In the open effects section, if you're trying to follow along, it is important that you click open effects, it will trip you up. And I drag it into my clip. This adds the effect, and so then I can just scale it so that way it actually looks more like noise. Who would have thought that having a bunch of blobs at 0 makes it look like that? And then I go to auto animation, I up the Cs, which makes the noise change as you go through each frame. Without it, it just stays static, doesn't change. But I want this to change. And then for the composite, that way it's not literally just sitting on top, I switch it to overlay. And that creates a much nicer gradual noise. And because sometimes I don't want it to be so strong, I make the blend 0.5. That's normally my standard. Sometimes I've upped it, but usually it's about 0.5. Just because now it's like a nice little grain, right? It's not super noticeable, but it does add a little bit. So at this point, now I can take my transcript, right? That those labels that I got from the Whisper transcription that should be finished at this point. My audio from my music on Spotify is also probably finished at this point, so then I can throw that in as well. And so I can go down here and I can go auto subs light, and then I just have to plug in the SRT file that I created earlier, which I normally store. So I can plug in my SRT file, right? And then I can hit add subtitles. And it throws them in there, super nice. However, at a certain point, not too long ago, I actually discovered an even better method, because this service here that I'm using, this is a plugin called Auto Subs. They came out with a version 2, and version 2 actually does the thing from Audacity where it does the Whisper transcription for me and then automatically puts it into my timeline. And so sometimes, depending on where I am in my workflow, this also may take some time. I've been using the medium model, so it's even more accurate. I haven't had to make nearly any edits to it, and that's super helpful. And so while this is transcribing, I then will usually jump into Photoshop. I always want to make sure that my new Photoshop file is a 1280 by 720 file, right? Because thumbnails can't actually get any bigger than that on YouTube. And so now I'm like, all right, I need something to be my thumbnail, and I usually just use something from the video that I had earlier. So I'll like open up the video on its own like this, and I'll just look through it. I'll just be like, okay, you know, they got it coming up on a boss fight, right? That's a kind of cool shot right there. So let's snip that real quick. Shabam. Right? And so I just snip it, and then I paste. Boom. It's here. I can rescale it. Set it up like so. And then most of mine are just kind of like a simple word, right? So in this case, you know, maybe it could be like fighting. Well, I go back and forth on whether or not I want all capital letters or regular or all lowercase. It depends. You know, in this case, we could say fighting the boss because, well, it's a big boss battle. I'll scale it up a little bit. In this case, I'm looking at it, I'm like, you know, maybe I want to get some like curve in here actually. That could be really cool. And so what I do in that case is that I actually can create a curve. So I take my curvature pen tool and I just kind of like trace this line here. I'm just eyeballing. I'm not trying to be super on point. You know, try and fix it up a little bit. That way it looks smooth. That looks all right. And then I'm going to just click on my text tool and then click onto the line in the middle where I made it. And now we have this text pulled up here. And I'm gonna say, fighting the boss. Now, I'm not actually sure why it's being produced over there. I want it to be closer, so I'm going to put it more like here. Fighting the boss. And I want it to kind of like go all the way, so I'm just gonna make it bigger. Ooh, too big. Let's go with 125, 115. Cool. Okay. Let's actually take it a little bit more. Let's go from here. Fighting the boss. you know, I play around with this a bit. This is, nowadays, the thumbnail does actually take me a good amount of time, and I do enjoy making these thumbnails. They're pretty fun. I get to play around with these things. I never considered myself much of a visual artist or a graphic designer, but there's something very fun about just like inserting some text. I've learned some effects and little adjustment layers that I can add to make this even cooler, right? Because this is fine, but it's not that great. So first thing I always add is a drop shadow to my text, and that adds some nice little difference there, makes it a lot more readable. Boom. I usually use some of the default settings that I've been playing with. Sometimes I make it a little bit more dramatic, depends. This one, I think I am going to pump it up a little bit, but give it a little bit more distance, perhaps, right? If you saw my contrast thumbnail, that one was an absolute ride. That was such a crazy experiment. But then I'm going to go ahead and play with the brightness and contrast of the whole composition. I hit the auto at first just to kind of get like a nice point of like, okay, what could I play with here? Because usually it will give me something interesting to think about. And then I can play with some of these values. Maybe I want this brightness and contrast to only affect the background. So I'll hold down Alt and then click when it's in this position here. So it only affects that. And so then I can play with this. I can maybe bring the contrast back a little bit. But I also like to have my layer of noise. Once again, I feel like that's kind of like a fun little trademark for me. So I just make a new layer, put a paint bucket on it, and I put noise. Go through this. I've used filter for noise, add noise, and then and then I play with the opacity a bit, bring it down to something around 20, around there. And then I once again do that overlay from DaVinci Resolve. Sometimes I've added more noise. For example, on my growth video, I think I was doing a lot more with noise. I am pretty proud of that thumbnail. I do like that one very much, but not every single video needs it. I like to reorder it so that way my text is clearly on top. It doesn't need to have that noise on it most of the time. And then from here, I continue to just play with values and see what feels right. Sometimes I feel like bringing the saturation down. Sometimes I feel like playing with the saturation of the text as well. So like I want to pump that up a bit, but then I want everything else to be a bit more muted. So then if I come here, I can bring the saturation down for everything else, right? And so now we've got ourselves a little bit more of an interesting color dynamic here. Every once in a while, I'll add a vignette. So I do that by making a new layer, and then I take the gradients, right? And I make a radial gradient. And actually, I think for this case, this might be really cool because of how the dragon is set up. I like this style. And so I'm going to bring this thing down in opacity a bit. And I'm going to add this as an overlay as well. Overlays and sometimes multiplies are my friends. Overlays, multiplies, darkens, they all do different things that I don't think I can really fully explain very well, but they have cool effect. And playing with them and seeing what feels right for you is definitely cool. In this case, by doing this, I'm getting this kind of cool like brightening effect that's happening on the text. On my exhausted video, which is one of my favorite thumbnails I made, it has a gradient centered from the fire and then expanding outward. So some of the text closest to the fire itself has more of an orange cast to it. It's very subtle, but I do love it. So at this point, just some quick little things. These are all like very routine for me. I do these for almost every single one of my thumbnails, so it happens very rapid fire. And we can see a big difference between this and, oops, that's a bit too much. The big difference between this and this. right? It's pretty cool, pretty cool. At this point, I save the Photoshop file, and then I export it as a thumbnail, and then I jump into YouTube. As I'm preparing something, maybe I'm waiting for a whispered transcription, or I'm waiting for my subtitles, or I'm waiting for whatever, sometimes I'll open up the different tabs that I know I'm going to need later. And so like for this right here, I normally have this ready, and as soon as I have my video rendering, then I can drop it in here. Depending on how the workflow goes, I normally like to have my video already rendered or rendering as I go into the thumbnail process, because then by the time the thumbnail is done, my video is normally done rendering. If I catch it before I'm done with a thumbnail, I'll try and put the video in first. That way it can start processing, because sometimes these videos do take a hot minute. Turns out if you add noise to a video, it really does crank up some of the size. It makes it a lot harder to process. But I'm just gonna throw in that random Enter the Gungeon clip that I used before. And from here, I can just click this nice button called Reuse Details, take one of my old videos, bam. I don't copy the title, but I can copy all these other things like the description. So I can just be like, boom. I update the gameplay with whatever the game is. I believe it was made by Dodge Roll. Music. I go back to whatever that Spotify track was that I decided on, put that in there. If they're on YouTube, I try to credit them. You can't really post external links into your description until you've been fully verified by YouTube, and I'm still waiting for that process. But I can upload my thumbnail, and no, this video is not made for kids. This is something that you just kind of have to turn off if you still want to have comments. So yeah. And then we can go ahead and go through checks, visibility. I scheduled all of these videos for 8 p.m. every single day, assuming that I made the video before 8 p.m. If I made it after 8 p.m., then I would just make it public immediately. But yeah, this was the whole process. And as you can see, we're actually at the 23-minute mark. So, wow, longest video I've ever made. But most of the time remaining in my hour is spent, adjusting the subtitles and getting stuff like that. But genuinely, this is how fast my process has gotten. It used to take me all the way up to the hour, and it was not as strong. I didn't have, the noise. I didn't have some of the color correction. I didn't have very good subtitles. And I go back and forth with the subtitles, honestly. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But most of the time, I'm just like, I'm not gonna worry too much about it. But genuinely, I have gotten really good about just automating this process for myself. The recording normally takes me about 5 minutes, right, for my voice. And so that's the only part that you really didn't see in this process. But that's my entire workflow. I'm super proud about it. It's made making these videos a very fun and incremental process. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this video forever. And yeah, I'm glad that you were able to jump along if you are still here. And if this is something that kind of like inspired you to help you get your process moving, awesome. But this is kind of just a great checkpoint for me to be able to look back maybe a month or a year from now and say, oh, this is how I was doing it before. I am pretty proud of this process, but I suspect I'll be able to refine it even further as the days go on, as I continue making more content, and I am super excited about that. In fact, the auto subs thing that I mentioned earlier, this guy right here, has been a very recent change, and it has shaved probably a good 5 minutes off of my creation time. But yeah, that is how I managed to do this. If it wasn't for this process that I continued to iteratively improve on, these videos could have taken way longer. And so if it wasn't for that, I don't know if this would have happened. I don't know if I would have been able to make it this far. And it absolutely blows me away to be able to say that, yes, I've done this for 30 videos. This is super awesome. And I can't wait to take this strategy that I've cultivated and push into new kinds of content, new types of artistic expression, if you will. So yeah. And so, at fear of sounding kind of cringe, thank you so much for watching. And you know what to do. So do it.